Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel, and Happy New Year. It's the first upload of 2023, and today I'm going to be counting down the top 15 greatest classic rock bands of all time. One quick note here before we get started, this list is for bands only, so I won't be including any solo artists, so, David Bowie, Jimi Hendrix, Billy Joel won't be included here on this countdown. I did a video a while back counting down the top 15 greatest solo artists in classic rock history, which I can leave the link to that video in the description box below if you want to check it out. But today, just focusing on the best classic rock bands of all time, and these lists are just my opinions. I normally do top 10s. I expanded it here to a top 15 to fit more bands in, but obviously I can't fit every great rock band there is out there, but these are just, in my opinion, the 15 best in classic rock history. So that said, let's get started here with number 15. Let's kick off the list here with my number 15. I'm going to go with Kiss. But in particular, I want to specify here, it's going to be the original lineup of Kiss only, that being Gene Simmons, Paul Stanley, Ace Frehley, and Peter Criss. And I wanted to specify that because Kiss are a great band with a really extensive catalog. But when you look through their catalog around the mid-'80s, they started to, change from being the trendsetters to following trends, and they would endure a number of lineup changes during their unmasked period. And, during that time, they would dabble in, trying to chase the trends of glam rock and, writing ballads, even a grunge album in 1997, until they would reunite with the original band and begin to really pursue what has been the theme for the rest of their careers up until this point as a legacy band. So I did want to specify here that even though there is some great stuff from, the post-original lineup eras of the band, I am only on this list going to be including the work of the original band. So this entry here is for the original lineup of Kiss only, and those first 7 studio albums are just perfect in my opinion. Some of the best rock albums of the 70s as far as I'm concerned. I think Peter Criss is an incredible drummer that gets really underrated and overhated by a lot of people. Of course, Paul Stanley in his prime was a great vocalist. Now, not so much. Ace Frehley, an incredible guitarist in his own right, and Gene Simmons, great bassist, awesome lyricist as well. Just a fantastic band, and, when they were able to work together, obviously later on egos would become a problem, but when they were first starting out, those first few albums, when they were working together and everybody was contributing equally, or at least that was what they wanted you to think, the albums were fantastic, and, the band were really gelling together in a way that I think every other Kiss lineup had failed to do. So, in my opinion here, the best Kiss lineup, and the only one I'm going to be including here on this list, is the original. So coming in at number 15, let's go with the original lineup of Kiss: Gene Simmons, Paul Stanley, Ace Frehley, and Peter Criss. Next at number 14, let's go with the best-selling American hard rock band of all time, Aerosmith. With great albums in their catalog like Twice in the Attic, Get a Grip, and Permanent Vacation, it would be a real crime for them not to be included here on this countdown. Fronted by Steven Tyler, one of those recognizable voices in all of rock, they're not without their share of controversy over the years, and that might be an understatement, but they went on to influence so many great rock and metal bands such as Guns N' Roses, Skid Row, the Black Crowes, just to name a few, that I'd be remiss not to include them here on this countdown. So that said, coming in at number 14, let's go with Aerosmith. Following that up here with my number 13, I'm going to go with one of my favorite bands of all time. That is Deep Purple here, coming in at number 13. They're one of those bands that really taught me to appreciate the musicianship of a band. There's a lot more to Deep Purple than just, the vocalist and then a riff, There's also excellent improvised guitar solos by Ritchie Blackmore, right? You've got some great drumming by Ian Pace. John Lord on the keyboards was an absolute beast. So many different factors that went into what made Deep Purple so great in their prime. And really, when it comes to their lineup changes over the years, I enjoy work from Mark 1, 2, 3. I'm not a big fan of the stuff they did with Joe Lynn Turner briefly, but aside from that, they've always had excellent musicianship and always were able to release, I think, albums that range from solid to great, From the Mark 1 lineup, which tends to get really, underrated and overlooked, I think that the Book of Talisman is a great psychedelic rock album. Then with Mark 2, they really did come into their own with albums like Machine Head. Mark 3, Burns, Stormbringer with David Coverdale and Glenn Hughes. Great stuff. So, over the years, Deep Purple have continued to uphold a certain level of instrumentation and musicianship that is bar none compared to any other band. So, that said, coming in at number 13 here, they're one of my all-time favorites. Gotta go with Deep Purple. Number 12, how about the Grateful Dead? They're a band that I think a lot of people might have ranked higher. There are a lot of diehard Grateful Dead fans out there, but there's no denying they're one of the most important rock bands of all time. Not just for their musical contributions, but also for the major major cultural impact they were able to cultivate during their careers as well. Hands down, they're one of the best live rock bands of all time, known for their long jam sessions and great improvisation, dabbling in elements of rock, folk, jazz, blues, and more as well. So definitely a band who had an excellent range and were fantastic in a live setting, and so important to the culture change in the 60s as well. So that said, coming in at number 12, I'm going to go with the Grateful Dead. Again, some people might have them ranked higher, but for me, I think number 12 is a fair spot to put them in. Just a great band and definitely deserving of a spot here on this list. Coming in at number 11 now, I'm going to go with Van Halen. Now, they're another band that I think some people might have ranked a little bit higher, but don't get it twisted. I do love Van Halen. I think their catalog ranges from, solid albums to great, except for maybe that one Gary Cherone record, which I think, if anything, is misguided. The ideas were definitely there, and Gary Cherone is a talented guy, but in execution, it was a very flawed record, in my opinion. But, that said, outside of the Gary Cherone record, I do enjoy just about every album in their catalog. I think that's the only black smudge in their discography, as far as I'm concerned. And of course, if you've been a follower of my channel, you know that, one of my big unpopular rock opinions is that I'm a bigger fan of the Van Hagar stuff than I am of the David Lee Roth era, even though I do love both eras, and their debut, of course, is one of the all-time best rock debuts, bar none. But for me, I've just gravitated towards the Van Hagar era more and more over the years. I do think that that's the better era that I gravitate towards, just a little bit more, but they're both fantastic. And again, outside of the Gary Cherone album, everything in their catalog ranges from, really, really solid to, awesome, iconic. And of course, the driving force behind Van Halen for all those years was Eddie Van Halen on guitar, one of the best to ever do it, and somebody who is sorely missed in the music scene today. Also, I think Alex Van Halen on the drums, really underrated drummer, does not get his due, in my opinion. So, a very talented family, needless to say. A great band, our Van Halen, one of the best in rock history as far as I'm concerned. Coming in at number 11 here, gotta go with the mighty VH. Moving on now into the top 10, coming in at number 10 on the list, I'm going to go with Black Sabbath. Now, Sabbath are one of those bands like Deep Purple that I think could fit on a list of the best rock bands of all time and could fit on the best metal bands of all time as well, if I were to do a list of those, which I'm sure I'll do at some point. But Black Sabbath, of course, an excellent hard rock band, but one of the pioneers of heavy metal as well. It would eventually go on to personify doom metal. So in addition to being a great rock band, they were so influential in pioneering heavy metal that we all know and love today. Of course, the original lineup saw Ozzy Osbourne fronting the group alongside Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward, but after Ozzy's departure, they would bring in Ronnie James Dio, and Bill Ward would depart the group as well. You get the Mob Rules lineup with Vinny Appice and Dio taking their place. Great lineup as well. I even enjoy the Tony Martin stuff. I think Born Again with Ian Gillan is really underrated as well. So, their whole catalog, I think, is really, really strong, with the exception of Forbidden, which is, like, one of my least favorite albums of all time. But that is not the fault of Tony Martin. There were a lot of, poor factors at play for that record. But in general, Black Sabbath's catalog is extremely strong, in my opinion, and they're one of the most important and influential rock and metal bands of all time. So I'd be remiss not to include them here in my top 10. Coming in at number 10, I'm going to go with Black Sabbath. Psychedelic rock legends, The Doors, coming on the list here at number 9. I love The Doors, one of my favorite psychedelic rock bands of all time, and of course Jim Morrison fronting the band. They did the best work with Jim Morrison. I think particularly this entry here pertains to just the work with Jim Morrison in the group. Of course, the band would continue after his death for a couple of albums, but I really don't care for those. I don't own them. I don't consider them to be essential Doors listening. So for me, when I think of the Doors, I think of their work with Jim Morrison and really nothing else. Those iconic albums in their prime during Morrison's lifetime are what made them one of the best rock bands of all time as far as I'm concerned. Their debut was one of the best psychedelic rock albums ever. So was Strange Days. You've got Waiting for the Sun, Morrison Hotel, LA Woman, just all great albums in their catalog during the lifetime of Jim Morrison, who was, a moody, enigmatic frontman, somebody who was really eclectic during their live shows, and you were going to get one of the best shows you ever saw, or one of the worst shows you've ever seen, depending on, the mood of Jim Morrison for that show. He was a very moody guy, so definitely one of the most important frontmen in all of rock history. Some people consider him to be more of a poet than a rock star, but there's no denying that he lived the rock star lifestyle and was the embodiment of the rock star death for a long time as well. So whether you consider him to be a poet or a rock star, there's no denying he's one of the most important figures in all of rock history, and the frontman to one of the best rock bands of all time as well, The Doors. Great work there in The Doors catalog from Jim Morrison's lifetime. So that's The Doors that I'm talking about during his life. So coming in at number 9 here, let's go with psychedelic rock legends, The Doors. Breaking out the vinyl here for my number 8, I'm going to go with Rush, a band synonymous with their incredible musicianship. eclectic compositions, of course, signature vocals by Geddy Lee, of course, a great bassist as well, and then the trademark drumming by Neil Peart, however you want to pronounce his last name. It seems like whenever I cover Rush here on this channel, someone tells me I'm mispronouncing the guy's last name. You know who I'm talking about. Incredible drummer, one of the all-time best, and Rush, of course, an incredible band, with some great albums in their catalog, career-cementing, defining albums that really helped to, shape classic rock as we know and love it today. Albums like this one right here, Moving Pictures, 2112 as well, just to name a couple. Awesome, awesome band here with a great catalog that are no longer, doing it. Of course, Neil Peart passed away a few years ago, but an incredible band with a great catalog. Coming in at number 8 here, I'm going to go with the one and only Rush. For my number 7, I'm going to go with The Who. And of course, The Who, their classic lineup consisted of Roger Daltrey, Pete Townsend, John Entwistle, and of course Keith Moon. The late great Keith Moon, one of the all-time best live drummers. Roger Daltrey remains to this day one of the most entertaining frontmen in all of rock. And Pete Townsend, in my opinion, is one of the best songwriters in rock history. So the band are synonymous with standout albums in their catalog like Quadrophenia, Tommy, Who's Next, and Live at Leeds. A great live band, great studio band as well, with some really interesting concept records in their catalog to boot. So this is a great band here from top to bottom. Very important, influential, and one of the all-time best. Coming in at number 7 here, I got to go with The Who. Next at number 6, I'm going to go with Queen. And, Queen are one of those bands that I really don't need to sell you on why they're one of the best classic rock bands of all time. If you disagree, if anything, check out their performance at Live Aid 1985 and get back to me. Needless to say, that performance does all the talking for me. Breaking into my top 5 now, let's go with the Rolling Stones. And, for pretty much every entry here in my top 5, you can make a legitimate claim for any of them to be the number 1 spot. But the way I'm feeling today, the Stones are going to be at number 5 here. But that's not to downplay the incredible catalog the Stones have. And you might be asking yourself, why is he holding up their Satanic Majesty's Request? That's like one of the most overlooked and maligned albums in their catalog. But for me, I love it. It's my personal favorite Rolling Stones album. I love the way they were able to expand their range here and include elements of psychedelia into their catalog. I think it's a great record, really. Very experimental for the Stones, but really underrated to every sense of the word as far as I'm concerned. So it is my favorite Stones album, but they have so many great standout albums in their catalog, right? Just to name a few, you have Exile on Main Street, Sticky Fingers, Tattoo You, Beggar's Banquet. So many great albums out there in the Stones catalog, and of course live, they remain a live force to this day. Mick Jagger, one of the best frontmen in rock history, somebody who, even in his older age, is still such an energetic frontman and such a spectacle to watch live. I saw them live prior to the pandemic a few years ago, and it was still a great show. Very, very loud, uncharacteristically loud, but a great, great show. And of course, since then, we have lost Charlie Watts, one of the best drummers in rock history, but he certainly left behind a great legacy behind the drum kit. And of course, Keith Richards, one of the best live guitarists of all time as well. Somebody who is definitely one of the best on guitar. And again, when it comes to the Rolling Stones, they have so many great albums to choose from. Even though this is my favorite of theirs, there are still so many great records in their catalog to choose from. So their catalog is fantastic. Their live output is great as well. Coming in at number 5 here, let's go with the Rolling Stones. Coming in at number 4 now, I'm going to go with Led Zeppelin. And now here's another band that I'm sure people are going to be upset are not number 1 on the list. But for me, as long as they're in my top 5, I'm okay with that. Zeppelin, of course, you have Robert Plant on lead vocals, one of the best frontmen in rock history. Such a recognizable voice, super, super talented. Jimmy Page on guitar, one of the all-time best as well. John Bonham on the drums, need I say more? And John Paul Jones on the bass. All incredibly talented musicians, and that lineup remains one of the all-time best in rock history. They never made a bad album as far as I'm concerned, and it's a shame that they disbanded after the death of John Bonham in 1980. You can only think about what other great records they would have made after, after Into the Outdoor, and if they would have continued following John Bonham's death. But following his death, they would disband and never made another studio album, which is a shame. But we do have all the classic records from the 70s in their catalog to look back on. So great work by Led Zeppelin throughout their career, even though they could have been around a lot longer. They did some excellent work during the lifetime of John Bonham. So coming in at number 4 here, I'm going to go with Led Zeppelin. Breaking into the top 3 now, for my number 3, I'm going to go with Pink Floyd. And, I've been on a massive Pink Floyd kick lately. Seems like it's all I've been listening to. Just an incredible band, and throughout every era of their career managed to maintain great musicianship and instrumentation. Of course, you have the early stuff, the psychedelic stuff with Syd Barrett, and then after Syd would, start to go crazy, he would leave the band, and fortunately for Syd Barrett, he would never really recuperate from that. But the band would continue, right? You have that middle period there, very experimental stuff with metal, obscured by clouds, right? Uma Guma, Adam Hart, Mother. Uma Guma, not really a big fan of that record, but, aside from that era is pretty solid as well. And then they really found themselves during the classic era with albums like Dark Side of the Moon, Animals, Wish You Were Here, The Wall. Even the Final Cut I would throw in with those albums, maybe not on the same level as those records, but still great from that era of the band. That, of course, would be the final with Roger Waters as he would depart the group after that. And, following the departure of Roger Waters, Pink Floyd would make a few more albums. You'd have A Momentary Lapse of Reason, which I think is a very solid record as well. And you have The Division Bell, which is very solid. The Endless River, their final record from 2017, is decent, but nothing to write home about. And for me personally, I'm more of a fan of the Roger Waters solo stuff than I am of the Pink Floyd post-Roger Waters material, but it's all great stuff as far as I'm concerned. It's such an addictive catalog. Once you start listening to Floyd, you cannot stop. At least that's what I've found, and I've been on a huge Floyd kick lately, like I said, which may or may not have influenced my decision to put them at number 3, but needless to say, they're one of the greatest rock bands of all time and definitely deserve a spot in the top 3, so that said, coming in at number 3 here, I'm going to go with Pink Floyd. My number 2, one of the most important bands for me is ACDC. This is the band that got it all started for me. I was first getting into rock music. ACDC was my gateway. I was a huge fan of Back in Black, Flick of the Switch, for those about to rock right away. Gravitated towards the Brian Johnson stuff early, and then, I saw them live in 2015. It was a great concert. And then in 2016, Axl Rose came in, and he replaced Brian Johnson, who had to step down due to his hearing loss. And, for me, I was just a kid at the time. AC/DC were my favorite band, and I had this feeling of, where did my band go? So for AC/DC, they were kind of spoiled on me for a while. I was soured on the band, and it wasn't until I really started to dive into the Bon Scott era of the band that's kind of what pulled me back into my AC/DC fandom. And, since then, it's hard to deny that AC/DC are one of the greatest classic rock bands ever. Whether it be the Bon Scott era or the Brian Johnson era, it's all great stuff, even though for me now, as I get older, I prefer the Bon Scott stuff just a little bit more. It's all great, it's all iconic, and I love the simplicity of AC/DC. It's no nonsense, down to business rock and roll. Angus Young is the ultimate showman, an incredible guitarist in his own right, a great live player as well. And Bon Scott, Brian Johnson, two awesome vocalists as well. Phil Rudd, great drummer. Malcolm Young, a genius, the brains behind AC/DC. And Cliff Williams, an awesome bassist. So the band are extremely talented and, maintained a certain level of musicianship and professionalism throughout their career that a lot of bands just couldn't. So AC/DC, my number 2 here on the list, a personal favorite for me and one of those important bands in my lifetime because, like I said, they're the ones who got it all started for me with, Back in Black, It Feels About to Rock, all of those, Brian Johnson records that are classics today. So that said, coming in at number 2 here, I'm going to go with AC/DC. And before I get to my number 1 here, I do have a handful of honorable mentions. Usually I do 5 honorable mentions, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to expand it to 7 mentions here. So I want to give some special recognition out to Guns N' Roses, Lynyrd Skynyrd, Jethro Tull, Jefferson Airplane, Creedence Clearwater Revival, Fleetwood Mac, and the original Alice Cooper group. All fantastic bands, but I can only fit 15 here on the list today. And finally, coming in at number 1, if you've been a follower of my channel, this should not be surprising. My number 1 pick, in my opinion, the greatest classic rock band of all time has got to be the Beatles. And, for me, the Beatles really did help for me to expand my range and my taste in music and really did help for me to get into a lot of the bands on this list. They're so important for me, in my musical interests were the Beatles when I first discovered them. And, of course, you hear them on the radio all the time. You don't think much of it, but it wasn't until I bought Sgt. Pepper and I played it, I listened to it, had to have listened to it about 20 times, and I really realized how fantastic the Beatles were. And after that, I binged their entire catalog. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, an absolutely masterful songwriting duo. George Harrison, really underrated in his own right. And Ringo Starr, the glue that held the band together. A great drummer as well. The Fab Four, a fantastic lineup. And it's a shame they broke up after the release of Abbey Road. Then subsequently, you would have the release of Let It Be. But they're a band that did great work in the 70s and the 60s. Or excuse me, I should say the 60s. And they broke up in 1970. But, if you could only think about what would have happened if they would have been a Beatles reunion, it's so disappointing to, see what happened to John Lennon and the fact that just never could have happened after that. So, for me, the Beatles are, in my opinion, the greatest classic rock band of all time. And we have, in such a short period of time, all those great Beatles albums that came out in the 60s. They started out doing Please Please Me. Only a few years later, they would drop Sgt. Pepper, which is just such a different album musically from their debut. And just to see how they progressed as a band to the short period of time is really, really interesting to me, from a sonic perspective, how their sound evolved over the years, as well as their look and their lyricism, their songwriting traits, things of that nature. Really, really interesting to me. And of course, they would all go on to have really successful solo careers after the final Beatles record, Abbey Road. They would all disband and go on their own way. They would all do some great solo work as well. So for me, in my opinion, the best classic rock band of all time has got to be the Beatles. So that wraps up my list here, counting down the top 15 greatest classic rock bands of all time. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel down below. Let's start the new year off right. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell for notifications so you never miss a new upload. Let me know down in the comments below, what did you think of my list, and what are some of your favorite rock bands of all time? I'd be very interested in hearing your picks, so let me know all that good stuff down in the comments. And until next time, it's the CD guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Happy New Year.